Hello, everyone. I hope this is working. I'm still seeing things load. So hopefully, here we are for a wonderful, exciting Facebook Live. Hopefully, you've been keeping yourself nice and well. Today, we're going to talk about census records, those wonderful building blocks that make family history. We have parish records and civil registers for our names and dates and all kinds of other things that give us those birth, marriage, and death. But how do we tell how people lived? And that is why we use census records. And there are lots of census substitutes as well. So we'll cover those too. We have about an hour. Welcome, everyone. I see you all starting to feed in. Suzanne, Karen, June, Kim, Linda. Hello, everyone. Hope you're nice and safe indoors, or at least you're in your own garden away from other people. Hi, Tess. Hi, Ellen. Hi, Lindsay. Nice to see all of these familiar faces. Maybe one day after all of this, we'll stand 2 meters apart and wave at each other in some event or other. And so this is a chat, really. So we're going to do, as we have done with other things that we've talked about together, we're going to be talking, giving tips, talking about different things that we can do with census records, different things you might not know. And then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers as well. So get them in. Ellie is in the comments doing her wonderful job at moderating and making sure everyone gets seen. And she'll be posting things to me as well in case I miss something. So I'm going to try and keep my eye on everything flowing through. And fingers crossed, we'll make sure that everything works nice and smoothly. So let's begin with censuses. I mean, when we start to talk about censuses, where do we start? And I guess the first thing would be the meaning of census, and it's Roman. Censere is the original thing, and it means basically a count of the population. Censuses are used through history in a number of different ways, but they're official documents, and they're always government-led, or let's say whoever's in charge creates them. And they tend to do it to understand more about those people under their care or under their responsibility. So when you look at some different censuses from around the world, for example, you can see what these governments and who these people thought were important and the different things that these different cultures and societies found interesting. So in ancient Egypt, early censuses give you things like the amount of honey that Egyptians had and things like that. We have fragments of censuses throughout history, some thousands of years old. There's a very early Chinese census, I think. It's almost 2,000 years old. Still considered genealogically useful, but it's going to be hard to get back to that point. So, there's a bit of a gap. And the same, we have Roman fragments. We even have censuses from that census mentioned in the Bible, and that fragment, again, hard to get to, and it doesn't cover the areas that we read about in the Bible, but it's interesting to see bits of history preserved from so long ago, and it can help colour our judgment when we look at the later modern British censuses. The first British census began in 1801, and you might be familiar with 1841, and we'll get to that one, don't worry, but we'll start with 1801 and move forwards. And it began for a number of different reasons. There were 15 reasons in total, but there were two very large ones. The first one was because of a man named Robert Malthus. You may have heard of him, and you may have heard of Malthusian growth and all kinds of stuff, which sounds like something that you need to go to a doctor for, but it's a cause for concern in the era of the Industrial Revolution. They started to look at statistics in a new way. It's really interesting when you look at these things where people started to say, well, let's plan towns. Let's not just let them happen. Let's do things. Let's see where people are living and how they're moving. And there are all kinds of great different laws and rules that start to be invented when people see patterns in humanity. And they're all really useful. There's a great thing when you look at surnames called the Galton-Watson process, which I'm sure we'll talk about another time. I don't want to get waylaid, but that's another great Victorian thing to look at when we're trying to work out where ancestors have got to. But Malthusian population concerns were basically that the population started to grow quite rapidly when machines meant that people didn't have to work in the fields for 7 days a week. They got up to other things. I wonder what. And when they did that, as the population spread, then the idea was it was doubling and doubling and increasing in such a speed that eventually the population would overwhelm the country and we'd have no food, we'd have mass starvation, we'd have war, conflict. And so they wanted to keep an eye on that. And luckily, it's tailed off a little bit. It didn't exponentially grow in the way that was expected, but the government was marginally concerned and thought, let's start tracking population numbers. Also, there was something going on. The French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars were at this point, and so to know how many able-bodied men were in the country was very useful, so they could decide, who they could conscript and how they could grow the army, which was really a national army for sort of the first time at this kind of period. So these were the main reasons why the census began, and that helps you to understand why the early censuses are quite sparse. They are sometimes the name of a head of population, head of household, and then you have just maybe a number of people in that household, and so they're sort of useful. And they only exist in fragments because they tended to be recorded and then they destroyed them. In some places that still happened, and we'll talk about some other ways in that happens even today. But for this, it means that we have some fragments, and there are fragments on Findmypast for some areas. You can take a look in our record A to Z and type in census and you'll get a host of different ones. But also that means that we can't just go to one place and start searching. So when I see Kim saying they found family on the 1801 to 1821 census for Windfarthing in Norfolk. It is really helpful. And they also can vary. So I know there's one in London, just in East London, that counts the number of windows and dogs in a particular parish. I think that's 1831. It may even be for barking, but don't quote me on that one. I might have just seen the name and found that exciting. Whenever there's a pun, I get very interested. So these early censuses, if you can find them, they're great. Some online, some on Findmypast. Sometimes the Family History Society has transcribed them. Other times, they'll be in your local archives. So when they open up, get ready to take a look. But you can take a look at the National Archives Discovery Catalogue, which has a window into some of those local census substitutes and see if they have any of these things here in the early censuses. And then also, of course, your local archives catalogue itself, and take a look for census and things like that, and use the years that we know. They always begin in a year ending with a 1. So we have 1801, 1811, 1821, 1831. Those are the ones. Try all of those years and see what comes back. Hopefully, you might even just get one parish, but it may be your ancestors' parish. So that's what we're looking for. Then we get to 1841. And so 1841 is the first that really exists in any national scale. There are still a few gaps, and you can find out about those gaps, and I'll tell you how to shortly. Scotland's People has a little list for the Scottish Census on their website, and on our website, if you go to the record A to Z again, type in 1841, get to that 1841 England, Wales and Scotland census. On there, on the right-hand side, there's a little bit of a extra help section, and in there you'll get a list of all the known gaps. When you're looking and you get a 0 over and over, you might find that some of it doesn't survive. And through all of these censuses and everything else, if you think that this doesn't seem right, I can't find my ancestors in one of these censuses, start looking without a name and look for the place. And see how many returns you get, how many people you would expect to be in that area. So if we're looking at maybe a village, let's choose Bakewell in Derbyshire. Let's say there's maybe 2,000 people in there. And we see in the 1851 census, there's 2,000. 1871, there's 2,300. And 1861, there's 800. Then we know something's not quite right here. And maybe there's something missing. And sometimes it happens. They are paper. They may have been destroyed for whatever reason. They may not have survived. And we then have to think outside the box. And that might give us a reason why we can't find our ancestors in that area. They might still be there. We just don't have that census. So Kim says there's a list of areas that have earlier census records. I think there are a few. There's definitely one for Scotland. I'm not sure if there's one for England and Wales. If there is, that'll be a great thing if someone can share. And Rosie shared a great one for New Brentford 1811. And so there are quite a few. In Ireland, Marion, there are censuses. Censuses have a slightly different story. The censuses that we can use in detail in Ireland are 1901 and 1911. Earlier censuses, some of them were actually pulped by the British government in the First World War because they needed paper, which is a terrible, terrible crime in terms of genealogy, and others were destroyed. 1821 to 1851. We have fragments of those censuses, and they're available on Findmypast. It's like rolling a dice, really. These are the bits that have survived through the explosion of the Four Courts fire in 1922. So you may be lucky. It's worth having a look, but it's a little hit or miss. So I'd take a look at those. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about when it comes to censuses apply whether we're looking in Wales, Scotland, Ireland, anywhere else. So hopefully all of this will still be useful, and I'll work through. We can go from there. Ireland has a slightly different census yearing as we get further on because they had their civil war and things which move things, and so I think they have a 1926 census that is coming at some point, not a 1921. So we have now said when we move from 1841 census, we see that first national census with a few gaps, as I said. Always look at that record A to Z and go to the individual census page, see what's there, find out a little bit more about it. Also gives you access to unique search fields, which means we can search on anything. It also includes, if we're looking for John Smith or James Smith or anything like that, additional people in the household. If we're looking for him and we know the name of his parents or we know the name of his spouse, we can add that in. We can narrow things down so we can find those people a little more easily because those common names can really defeat us. One of the big things as well when we look at the 1841 census is that ages of all people over 15 were instructed to be rounded down to the nearest 5. So when you see some ages of people who are 75, they might be anything up to 79. Same when we look at people in their 50s, 40s. Sometimes enumerators didn't quite listen and they put exact ages. And when you look at a page, if you see a lot of odd numbers, then you might have been lucky. But for the most part, anyone over 15, you can assume their age has gone down. So when we're searching, we have to look with a lot more leeway on those ages. And then, of course, censuses were filled in or recorded by the head of the household. So that means that they gave the information. So we're only as good as their memory or, of course, what they want to sell you. So that makes things a little interesting. Some people will round their age up or down themselves because they want to maybe appear younger or maybe even they don't remember. There are always, in every family, I'm sure you'll all see it, and maybe we can do some way of showing and maybe say in the comments, you have one of those ancestors who seems to, every 10 years, age by maybe 7 years or 8 years, and they kind of just get a little bit younger every census. And I see that quite a lot. There's always one. It tends to be some great aunt or something like that. And I think they were actually sort of in their 80s and they seem to be in their 60s in the census. So you've got to be aware of that as well. But the 1841 census again said, keep an eye on that. Also, there are some marks on the census that are really important. When you see a single slash and you look at a census household, you see that it's the name of a different family begins. So you may have more than one family in the same building. A lot of people live together. They may have lived in tenements. They may have lived in more cramped conditions. These are people that your family would have known, but they're not part of their household. They are separate family. Perhaps that might be a story of how your ancestors met. Maybe there's some children that later grew up and married. But if you see that slash, you don't need to record those other people in your family tree because not yet, they're not part of it. When you take a look at the second slash, 2 slashes, that means we're looking at a completely new building. So that gives you a little bit more of advice too. And then, of course, when we look at these as well, addresses were fairly flexible then as well. They didn't have postcodes. They often didn't even have house numbers. So you may only find a street or an area of town. Not so many people were given post or mail at that point, so it didn't really matter as much. And those people that were talking to these people tended to know everyone because they tended to be in much smaller units. So the 1841 census, very big start, but then we moved to 1851. And it's important to know when we look at these censuses, 1841 all the way up to 1901, that these are slightly different from 1911 and 1921. When someone was filling in a census, they were given a form. This form was to be filled in. Not so many people could read and write at this sort of point, but some could. They did, and if they couldn't, then the enumerator would help them, and the enumerator would fill in that detail for them. Then those forms would be taken to a room, and in that room, an enumerator would copy all these things out into books. And these enumerators' books are what we have scanned and available to view and read. That's why you see household after household after household on one page, because they've been copied out. The original forms, once they were copied, were destroyed. We don't have access to those. I think there may be a handful of examples you might be able to find somewhere where they've been forgotten, but outside of that, we only have these enumerators' forms. That's why 1911 gets exciting, but we'll talk about that slightly later. And so you may have slight errors in people copying other people's handwriting. People couldn't read and write that well. Perhaps they couldn't be read by the enumerator as he copied things in. Maybe he couldn't hear things totally perfectly. One case that I looked at and I remember is that this family I was looking for from Northern Ireland moved to Birmingham, and they described where they were from, clearly to an enumerator. I don't think they had much education. Usually at this point it was in Sunday school rather than a proper state education, and so it was a very low level of education anyway, so their reading and writing was probably not good enough to fill in a census. And they were listed as being born in Dine, D-I-N-E, and I couldn't find that anywhere. I looked on every map, I tried everything, and it took me a long time to realise that Dine is down, spoken in a Northern Irish accent. So when I heard that and read it and sort of, okay, and then from using that, found them very quickly, straight away in Northern Ireland, in County Down. And so very easy to do. Once you can find that and once you remember that, it can help sometimes. You may have to use YouTube if you don't know a local, but finding your own ancestor's accent, it's actually quite a wonderful experience to hear your own ancestor's accent, because if you perhaps moved away from the area, you might never have heard it. And I was showing someone else a little recently, wonderful colleague Jen Baldwin, some black country accents, authentic, wonderful black country accents, and they're so lyrical and melodic. And the same with different Welsh accents and things, but they give different ways of pronouncing the same words. And when you can hear that, maybe that might give you an idea as to how things might be misspelled or mistyped. Of course, we have wildcards. If you don't know how wildcards works, big thing, really useful for family history. Use them across all of your record sets. First of all, if you use an asterisk means that there may be something in this space. We don't know, and we don't know how long it is either. And so perhaps I tend to put an asterisk in my own name. I find sometimes Cleland has one L in the second set, sometimes two. So if I put an asterisk there, it will give me everything that has one L or two L's without a problem. And also other letters. Maybe they've been mistranscribed. Maybe it's been mistranscribed as an F or something like that. And so I have, Clelfand. But it will find me that as well. So that's really useful. Then there's a question mark. A question mark is for when I know there's a letter here, but I'm not sure what that letter could be. So when you see A's and O's and things like that, they sometimes can be misread by an enumerator or by someone transcribing. And so when we put that question mark in, that means that we'll find them all, and we can have it that exact length. So if I put that in mine, the end, Cleland, could be Clelond, it could be anything, and I'll find those. So they're really useful as well. So use those if you can't find your ancestors in these records. Of course, then we have, as we move back to censuses, we move forwards 1851 as we get to. 1851 is where things get exciting. This is when they start to really kick in. We have exact ages for the first time. We have relationships to the head of household. So we see the head of the household, we see the children, we see all of this. You don't get that in the 1841 census, so we have to assume a little bit. And we can assume someone's a wife, we assume everything else. We see that people are born in the county, but we don't know if they're born elsewhere, where. So in 1841, we see born in this county, yes, no. And then if they're born sort of in foreign parts, which can mean they're from abroad, which can make things slightly difficult. And then we have, so this full relationship, we can see a full family for the first time, and then we see the county someone's born. If you find someone in 1841, try and find them in 1851, and you can give a more exact age, and you can give a more exact location of birth, which is really useful. When we're searching, that's what we need when we want to find those original records. I see Linda asking, is plumber's mate Royal Navy or Merchant Navy? Would they be called something else? So that's an interesting thing, and I was going to cover that a little later. When it comes to these occupations, starting from 1851, so it's a really nice time to bring it in, there's a great website called HistPop. And it's a analysis. It's an academic website of the statistics of the census, because the census wasn't really used for individuals during the time it was created. It was used for these great statistical broad brush analyses of the country. And so you'd have someone going through these enumerators in these big books, and they would classify everything, and they'd usually give them a number for different things. So when you look at people's occupation, perhaps you can't read it, perhaps you're not so sure, you can use the number that the enumerator's given to look up using the old enumerators books and the enumerators analysis books afterwards for the large sort of statistical analysis on somewhere like HistPop to show what classification that was. So there are maybe 100 different ways to describe a coal miner. They could be a coal hewer, they could be coal face worker, they could be different things described. When an enumerator copies things, it tends to be a little more specific and standardized, but when you're in your own words, a little harder, because you could call myself anything. So it's one of those things that we can then use that classification to help. They're not indexed, but it means if we can't read an occupation, it's a great way in. When you're looking and using an occupation and you're not sure what to look for, use those wildcards. If you know, plumber's mate, Royal Navy, Merchant Navy, anything like that, just use plumber and use an asterisk. And you'll get everything. Anyone with that name who has plumber in there, you'll find plenty of plumbers, but you'll find plumbers' mates, you'll find other things, and they may describe themselves in different ways. I have an ancestor who was a fisherman, and they never describe themselves as a fisherman. They're always a mariner or a seaman or something like that, because it sounds a lot nicer, doesn't it? It sounds a lot more exotic and a lot more exciting and grand. And grandiosity runs in my family, definitely. So that's a really good way to think of those, and occupations are really important, especially when we're narrowing things down. Often, because of the many different ways to describe occupations, I don't really search for an occupation in censuses. I wait and I see and I look at the census records I'm looking for individually and see what they say, and then use my interpretation to know if I've got the right person. As we move through to 1861, 1871, we keep going. We can keep going through, and we find slightly more detail each time we go through. They're largely, fairly similar, but they get more exciting again when we get to 1911. 1911 is the first census that we look at where the original returns survive and they've been scanned. So when we look at a 1911 census entry, you're looking at your own ancestors' world. This is how they saw the world, how they filled it in. So it's their own handwriting as well, their own signature. At this point, education was compulsory from 5 to 13, I believe. And so most people could read and write. Literacy was very high. There's a few instances where things were filled in by others, but you'll notice when you see the signature who filled it in and who signed it, so you'll know if this is your ancestors' handwriting. And you get to see that. You get to see something, and that's kind of magical. That's really exciting and wonderful to see that. There are instances, and they're not unique, they are rare, but there are instances of people, in the disability column of their infirmities, we can see, how they saw themselves. And you might see people who were perhaps deaf or blind or anything like that, members of the family. Sometimes they might write something like, I know of a farmer who writes that he's short of cash, and he considers that a disability. Sometimes you'll see people add their pets into the 1911 census because they thought they were part of the family as well. Sometimes you'll see people who were so brave that they believe that perhaps as women they weren't given the right to vote, so they shouldn't be enumerated. And they say it's a two-way street. You can't enumerate me if I haven't got the right to vote. And so many women, no one really knows how many, of course, because they avoided the census, so we can't tell you how many people aren't on a thing. Estimate perhaps around 10, 20,000 people. avoided census, but some were brave enough to actually deface the census or write things in. And there's a large collection of those on Findmypast of those people who were brave enough to risk possibly prison, possibly punishment, to show their political allegiance to the cause of women's suffrage. And if you can find an ancestor like that, it's something to be very proud of indeed. And so you can see that in the 1911 census. They are wonderful documents, and they're scanned in colour. Earlier censuses are black and white, because they're scanned usually from microfilm. And they tell us a lot about our ancestors. The 1911 census was called the fertility census because it gives you the years of marriage when you see a married couple, the number of children that have been born to that marriage, and the number of children still living. And that's, of course, really important because at this point, child mortality was common. It was a terrible reality of life at this time. Many people had 9, 10 children, sometimes more, and perhaps maybe only 7 or 8 survived, and the children may have lived in between censuses, which means that we haven't really got them to pick up on a census. So they may only live 1 or 2 years, and then we have to work from there. So that means we might only find them by saying, well, there's a missing name here, and go back to parish records or something like that to go through. I see Sue asking about the original censuses on Findmypast for Scotland, not just a transcript. For Scotland, we have transcripts from 1841 to 1901. 1911 is entirely on Scotland's people. And for the years 1841 to 1901, we have those transcripts. And those transcripts are really useful when you want to narrow down things. So always use the transcripts to look through, read the descriptions of all those people in Scotland, and then use that to get the exact record on Scotland's people, because you pay per image there. There's no unlimited use, and you're probably, especially in Scotland, going to have a name that you might have to look at maybe 5 or 6 records before you find the right one. Use that extra detail to know. And when you know, then use that, plug it in, and get the exact record in one go, which is what you need, really. So that's what you should use the Findmypast transcripts for. For 1911, it's all on Scotland's people, but Scotland has a rich set of census substitutes, which we'll talk about slightly later. So keep watching, and I'll definitely get you some more information that might be of use to you too. And so I see Kim saying her great-grandfather lied a lot on the 1911 census. And I see Pat again posting his pop, and Rosie posting a wonderful link there to Scotland's people to find those images of Scotland and Scottish censuses once you've used our transcripts. I see Tess talking about child mortality. He recently found out their Scottish great-grandfather had 4 siblings die before he was 7 years old, one of which in unfortunate or mysterious circumstances, accidental suffocation. That's a terrible story, and it's all too unfortunately common. And you'll notice sometimes that names are reused in this period. So when you see maybe 2 baptisms and you might find some ages that don't match, be sure when you look at baptisms that don't quite match and you're looking later on that you're not. I mean, I've just found this recently in my own tree, for one instance, that very confused me until I found another record that set it straight. I've took the earlier brother's baptism as the birth of my ancestor. And there was a complete brother, an uncle, who was born and died very, very quickly. He lived perhaps only about 3 months. And then my ancestor was born a year later. And so by finding this and going, well, that must be the one, it doesn't mean I had the right answer. I had to keep looking a little bit either side and make sure I'd had all of the children born to these parents to find the exact answer. And so that's one big thing. So the fertility census, the 1911 census, can really help you when we're plugging into that. And I see Sue saying the Irish lines leading to borders in Lanarkshire pre-1800. Some very good resources for the borders and for Lanarkshire. So I'll cover those too. I'll make sure to give them a special mention as we go through. So as we see, Marion says, what was the name of the website for occupations? HisPop. And I think Pat posted a link just earlier, hispop.org, if you want to find it. The 1921 census is coming wonderfully to Findmypast. It follows the 1911 census, again, every 10 years. And that one continues in the same vein as the 1911 census, asking more as we go along. And that one gives you not only people's occupation, but where they were employed. It tells you about their employer, which can be fascinating. It can tell you which factory your ancestor worked in, which mine they went down. That can tell you a lot about the character of somewhere. places like HISPOP are useful for earlier censuses to give you a rough idea of the character of an area. If you see perhaps that 80% of the population of your Cornish parish in 1860 were involved in mining, it gives you a real feel for that community, and that can help you when we're looking at different records and what we're looking for. So that's really important too. Of course, when we've told the story of occupation, we told things, but how does that affect the records we're looking for outside of the census? How can we use the census? We've got this snapshot of time, and it is only a snapshot. Remember, each census was taken on a particular day. And I won't give you the exact dates off by heart because I'm not great at remembering all of them, but I find them really quick to reference. I know Ellie's been doing a wonderful job at making a great little infographic that I'm sure she's going to share at some point with a little bit of extra information, and it gives you those exact dates. But many people at this sort of point were agricultural labourers. They may have moved from parish to parish at different times of the year, and we're catching them in spring or we're catching them in early summer. And so they may have only been in that parish for a short period of time. They may not have lived there, or they may have only been there for a couple of months. And so when we look at this, it's not an exact story of an entire 10-year period. It's a snapshot. It's a fragment. Sometimes you'll find people who are so young, their name hasn't even been given yet. We'll see, name not decided or something like that. 10 minutes old or anything. It's like taking a photograph of our ancestors at just one moment. It's supposed to be the stroke of midnight. Hopefully it is, and it's everyone in that house. Sometimes you'll find an uncle or an aunt who's come to visit at that point, and they don't live there, but they've just come for a little while. Maybe they're there for 6 months to see if their business idea gets going, and then they go back to where they really live. So we have to take that on board, and we can't just say that's where they were living. We have to use other records to frame things, to build the full story. So that's one of the big things to remember. In the 1911 census, there's one great thing you can do to get more of an idea of that character of a community. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner, I believe, when you look at your ancestors' 1911 census, I encourage you all to do this if you haven't. Really interesting. You'll see a little camera icon and additional photographs. And those additional images will tell you about the enumerator's walk. As he went from house to house, he was given perhaps a community, and he would describe the area that he was looking at, and you see a little more about your community, and you might find a little more of a description of the houses that your ancestors lived in, which can be fascinating. A bit of detail on perhaps the condition of those buildings and houses, and that can again give you more colour and more life to that family story. Trying to remember all of the things that we have to talk about. So many. I think we've got 25 minutes left, so I see some questions there. I see Pat saying their grandma had no name in 1901 census, newly born, so a wonderful living example of that. And this does happen. And Diane saying their great-grandparents lost 2 sets of twins within months of each other, and a baby girl, her name was used again. That's the thing, you see. When we find these names, be sure to look in this parish. There's a wonderful thing you can do on Findmypast where you can search without a name. Search with a surname, search with names of parents on parish records, and you can find all the children born to a particular couple in one particular parish or county. That's really useful for finding these people who have been perhaps baptised, but they haven't lived so long, and perhaps we're missing some siblings to tell that whole family story. So do use that as well. And again, visitor Alan has a good point. Visitors confirm family relationships of which you have previously been unsure. Very good point, Alan. It's one of those things when we look at those relationships, you know, we see brother-in-laws, we see other things, we see visitor, and those people, again, might not be living there. They might just be visiting for a little while, but that can help us because we know they must be connected in some way. We can dig through and maybe find some more information. So there are lots and lots of institutions in these records as well. We have workhouses, we have asylums, we even have ships if they're in British waterways or docked in port. We have barracks. They have slightly different forms. So you'll have, you know, the head of the household won't be the father or anything like that. It will just be perhaps the sergeant major or something, person that was involved, or the workhouse foreman. And then they would list everyone in there. And of course, if you look at something like a workhouse, it's a lot harder to find people's exact places of origin, places of birth, things like that. They have fallen on hard times. They may not even want to give us information. Sometimes they have to be assumed. They might give an assumed name. It makes things harder, but those institutional records might help you too. So do remember that they are taken also. And I see Kim saying that they follow the census takers walk and found the relevant maps. Very useful too. One great place I look for maps, the National Library of Scotland. I think it's NLS maps.nls.org. I think someone I'm sure much cleverer than me will be able to post a link. That doesn't just cover Scotland, covers all of Britain. Really great resource for moving backwards and forwards through time, finding those historic maps. Scale was only really used in the census era, and so we're lucky there. A little bit earlier, we can find some maps from the 1600s, 1500s, but scale goes out the window. It sort of moves around, so it's very hard to tell how big things were, or how large a community was. And when we find scale maps, we start with the Ordnance Survey, things like that, which is a primarily military endeavor to begin with. Then we can start to see how communities grow in a much better way. We can always do those exciting things, like on the 1939 Register map search. We can move through time with any kind of scale. We can see exactly what's in the same place. 1939 Register is a great census substitute. As we move towards a census substitutes in our time here, it's just like a census. It was created in a very similar way because, of course, we have the 1931 census was taken. For England and Wales, doesn't survive, unfortunately. Census taking was devolved to Scotland a little bit earlier. So Scotland took their own census in 1931, and it was stored separately. So the 1931 census for Scotland does survive. Not so for England and Wales. It was destroyed during the Second World War, not as a result of enemy action, as you might suspect, but it was just an errant spark. It was stored in a furniture warehouse, and all the remnants were swept away before anyone had a chance to inspect anything. So it's all gone. It's a terrible, terrible shame. 1941 census wasn't taken because, of course, we were slightly busy with something else. And then the 1951 census was, I guess, business as usual. So we have this large gap. We have the 1921. So this is why the 1921 census is so exciting. It's going to be the last big census in hopefully not our lifetimes, but it's going to be for a long time coming. We've got 30 years before we get the next census, and that's what the 1939 register is also exciting, because it's just like a census. A few slight differences. We've talked about the 1939 register in a previous video. Do recommend you come and take a look at that and get some real detail. It doesn't give you relationships, but it does give you exact date of birth, and it does give you households, every household, civilian population at this time. It can help us to move forwards and backwards. We're looking at people in living memory. We can find them. Perhaps you remember your grandmother, grandfather, mother or father. You can find them in the 1939 register. That might help you find them in a 1911 census if you can't find them. So that can kind of give you our run of census material that we can see, and core census substitutes. But there are lots of census substitutes. There are electoral rolls. We have a huge collection of those. If we're moving backwards from 39, we want to get to 21, we're going to get to 11. Electoral registers become really useful at this point. 1918 was a point when all men could vote for the first time, and of course some women. As we get earlier and we move further back through time, it becomes a little more difficult as fewer people could vote. The government had this strange idea that if we let poor people vote, all hell will break loose. What kind of chaos will ensue if we let normal people vote? I'll leave it to yourselves to decide if they were right or wrong, but now, luckily, we all have that universal suffrage that our ancestors struggled and fought for, and we can use these electoral registers to place our ancestors. In the 1880s, there's another broadening of the franchise. It's all men at this point again, and this means that perhaps your ancestors, if they were artisans, fairly middle class, perhaps they were skilled workers, they might be included. A little bit earlier, you're looking at more sort of people who rented or owned decent property, were quite large, in the community. So there's fewer of our ancestors in there. Still useful, but they're good for placing. There are also things like rate books, poor law, these kind of things that are useful to describe, almost like the council tax we have today, the money our ancestors paid for the upkeep of various different things, perhaps the sewer, the lighting, etc. in their streets. There are rate books for a number of places on Findmypast. They're really useful. Some are available in local places, and they can help you fill in the gaps, tell you where people are. And they were taken usually 2 times a year, so sometimes they'll tell you if someone was in an area only for 6 months of the year, etc. In Scotland, we have valuation rolls, which are very, very similar, and they are annual. On Scotland's people, I think they have on a 5-year basis for some years, and we have a huge collection for Dundee and Angus, or Forfarshire as it was, and a few other places. And those valuation rolls tell you the name of an owner of property and the tenant. They're very useful, again, to fill those gaps. If you find that someone's missing from a census, try and find other records like electoral rolls, valuation rolls, poor law, rate books, to try and fill that detail in between to see when they moved. See if you can find them going forwards year by year and move across. I see Angela asking, why are certain people blacked out in the 1939 register? The 1939 register is because it's so much like a census. The Census Act of 1920 is the big thing that governs all of this. So this is a government act that says that all of these censuses have to be kept safe for 100 years out of the way, because they cover such detail, and they cover living people, potentially people who are alive, and that information could be sensitive. So all of these records are stored, kept away. After a century, they're allowed to be released, which is why 2022 is when we're going to get hold of that 1921 census. We have to wait until then. The 1939 register isn't a census, but it's very census-like. So there's a compromise that we had to devise, this completely unique system that we made proprietary for the first time, where we matched people's death. Usually, because this was used for the National Health Service, up until the mid-90s. Again, best to rewatch that presentation, little chat that we had on the 1939 register a few weeks ago. You'll find in a live videos to talk about this in more detail, because I've got a lot more census things to cover in our last 15 minutes. But it means that we had a very good way of seeing that people were no longer with us or not. And then we could use our own death registers. After the 1960s, they started adding in exact dates of birth in our death registers. So that means we could be fairly confident we've got the right person. If someone marries in the 1939 register, we've got their maiden name and their married name included. And so we can open up those people who are no longer with us. Some people, we're not sure if they're with us or not. After 100 years, their records are opened. But if we're not sure if they're alive, then we keep that record closed. And you can open it. You can email us if you're a subscriber with the death certificate and where you think they are, and there we'll take a look and we'll open it for you if that's the correct answer. And also, you can ask the National Archives to search for anyone if you've got the information. Costs a little bit of money for their time, but again, well worth it if you can't find them. And then you can have that record open. So they're not closed forever, those black lines, but it just means that we can bring this to you, and we don't have to wait until 2040, which is where we'll be waiting for otherwise. And of course now, so William Shaw saying you can view records from the 1970s in the archive room. For valuation rolls, they continue, I think, even till today. I know they're very, very modern. So you can look at very modern valuation rolls. I think ours go up to the 1950s for Dundee and Angus. And they are really fantastic for moving further forwards. They don't give you as much detail as a census, but again, they're great for placing your ancestors, and they give you tenants as well as owners. Most people at this sort of point are tenants, and so that's important. The address search on Findmypast, there was some great family history sessions recently about house history and searching by address. That's really useful when we look at censuses, because as we move through censuses, and we see perhaps our ancestors in 1871, and then we miss them from 1881, maybe we need to look at that house and need to see who's in that house. If it's a different family, then okay, we know they've definitely left. Perhaps they've been mistranscribed, perhaps they're a member of the family's there, and that means they may have died. We can find that by using the address search. Find the same house, the same building, in the next census if we can't find them, and that might give us an idea of what's going on. NLS stands for National Library of Scotland, Karen, and they're a wonderful resource again. We have some of their records online, wonderful set of postal directories. Trade directories as well are great census substitutes, as well as there's postal directories too, for Scotland and for England and Wales, and they move not only between the censuses, but also earlier too. So if you find someone 1841, we can move further back and find them in the 1830s, even maybe the 1820s, with their occupation and their name. For Scotland, there are a host of census substitutes, many for England and Wales, but Scotland's particularly blessed. There are other documents, and there are lots of registers. You can find some census substitutes on Findmypast if you look in our record A to Z. There's a wonderful collection, a set. We have a Dalkeith one, and you maybe look around this week or next for some new records in a similar vein, and some great records for Dalkeith. You might be clever and you might spot that a little early, but there's some wonderful records to come. And there are also things like hearth tax and poll tax in Scotland. Great thing. There's a website called Scotland's Places that has some images of these, but we have some great searchable transcripts. We have it for all of Aberdeenshire, covering the late 1600s, going much further back, and hearth tax as well, and poll tax too. Poll tax covers a lot of the population. Hearth tax is for those people with a little bit more money, although still you have servants and other people too. And hearth tax is also available in England and Wales. There are a few projects to transcribe hearth tax from around England, and they are great, really useful. And you will find some hearth tax transcripts on Findmypast, and said for Scotland as well, but they move earlier, and they're just sort of like a census. Again, as we get earlier, we're looking at heads of household, different things, a little more difficult. For Ireland, there's something called Griffiths valuation, which is a taxation document. Again, it gives you, again, the head of the household, and it tells you, how much rent they're paying and things. One thing to remember in Griffiths valuation, wonderful maps that come with it, you can find on Findmypast. So look for the maps when you see the number on the left-hand side to find your ancestors and look at them in detail, where they came from. But when we look at perhaps more populated areas, like maybe Limerick, Cork, or the cities, of course, maybe Dublin. When we look at a tenement, they only list the first person they came across, or who they thought was the lead tenant. And so your family may be in one of these places, and they may not be visible because we only have that name of that head of the household and the name of the first person that answered the door. So it's a little more difficult when we look at that. But these census substitutes, things that relate to taxation, things that relate to population counting, the church were very, very keen on recording people at this kind of point. Often with earlier censuses, it would be a church elder that would go around, sometimes a school teacher. There's a wonderful census, an early census from Orkney that we have online, fantastically available for free. The images and transcripts were typed up and made into searchable database, and you can see these original scans of a copy of these early censuses that were kept. They were stored in a kitchen drawer for safekeeping, out of the way, and they survived when many other records don't. And they're available, said searchable on Findmypast. The original is now in Orkney Archive, safe and well, but obviously it was thought to be of interest, and it was kept by, I believe, a shopkeeper, and it was then kept in a farmer's kitchen drawer for all this time. And now we have access to that, and it gives us wonderful details. Actually, one of the more detailed censuses. So there are these little census substitutes and censuses that do survive. Do look in all of these catalogues and look for more detail. But for census substitutes, Scotland's got many, sometimes even 1700s, the mid 700s, with a lot of detail. And then we look at taxation. I said Scotland's Places is a great place for many different taxation records, but our indexes of hearth tax, poll tax are really useful if you're in the right areas. And then hearth tax and poll tax and window tax, all these different things were levied in England and Wales too. In Wales, there's a wonderful collection of tithe maps available for free. Those are great. The National Library of Wales published those. You have not only lists of those people who are indexed, transcribed, and then you see the maps that correspond to the original locations, just like we have in Griffiths valuation and other places too. And that's 1832, so that's just before the 1841 census, so that can be useful. I noticed Bianca and Jess talking about smoke in the background. I hope that's not my own house. I don't see anything on fire, but thank you for letting me know. If it is, tell me, because that might be a risk that I might have to deal with. But I'm pretty sure we're okay for now. Yes, so lots of detail there. Sorry, I've been slightly distracted by that. Good point from Eric. When we talk about censuses, 72 years in the USA, they don't have a 100-year hold in the same way as we do. So a lot of people, if you're, a little bit older, you can find yourself in there. And I had a great time showing an aunt of mine her own register, her own copy of the 1940 census. She was there. Her father was mistranscribed, so it was harder to find him, but we found him. And then you can see people you remember. That's what's so great about the 1939 register. You can find people in living memory. I think everyone can close their eyes and remember someone who can be found in a record from 1939 or 1940, and they can remember how they laughed or how they spoke and the little quirks, the wonderful things that made them them. And then we see them in a record, and it shows you that all the way through history, when we look at all of these censuses, it's the same. We find someone in 1861, someone I'm looking at the moment, my 4 times great-grandfather that I've been recently looking into, a man named Silas Duffield. It's wonderful. He's in Darlaston in Staffordshire. And I've got a photograph of him now, and I think I posted on the Findmypast forum his wedding photograph from 1898. And I see him, and I get this idea of him, and I see on a census, through the censuses, a little bit about his life, and I understand, but all of the things about the way he laughed, the way he talked, the things he liked, all that stuff, those memories, they were there. He was a person, a wonderfully well-rounded person, and I have to use what I can get from a census and other records, like maybe newspapers, a wonderful newspaper collection, to tell more of that story and to try and recapture that. That's why it's so very important when we look at these to understand that these are people, and we're telling a bit of a story, but we have that we've kind of lost and have to try and regain. If we can use other records and we can find out, these wonderful tales, that's more so the better. But censuses are the best place to begin to start to tell that. If we find an occupation, it means, as I see William Shaw has been saying, to then start looking at employment registers and employment records. If we know, this person was an apprentice shoemaker, maybe there's an apprenticeship record we can look at. Maybe they joined a trade body. Maybe they were in Burgess rolls. All of the things in a census can lead us to other things and help us to tell this story. And there are lots and lots of different things. And Audrey's talking about militia lists and things like that. Very, very good census substitutes. Nice to see you're quite close to Darlaston, Linda. It seems that my family, the Duffields, just were all over Darlaston. There's nothing but them, and they seem to have been pretty infamous for good and bad reasons. I'm really enjoying finding out more about them at the moment. But yes, militia lists are a really great census substitute, and also fencibles if you're on the coast. They only really listed men, able-bodied men. But they are really great, and they tend to start, during the Napoleonic Wars. So we've got the late 1700s all the way up to the mid 1800s. Very, very useful. And then in the same vein, there are protestation returns. So during the turbulent religious history in the 1600s, if you can get back that far, we have lists of people in the parish. It was supposed to be only the men, but often women signed as well. So you may be lucky. And it gives you all of the men that signed, sometimes their own names, sometimes they were listed for them and they signed with an X, of those people who signed the oath to say, their faith, the Protestant faith. And then the people that were not present, which was considered slightly suspicious. And so they were listed and named as well. So if you can use the protestation returns, they're on the Parliamentary Archives website. You can go to your parish. They're not indexed by name. Some we have lists of on Findmypast. We don't have the images, but they're free and they're available on the Parliamentary Archives website. You might find perhaps your ancestors in the mid-1600s in here, and you might then find some common names as well. Maybe find some ancestors. When we get to a point when the parish records are starting to thin out, these kind of records can be really, really useful. I see here lots and lots of people say, Anya saying, look for siblings with more obscure names. When I started, the name of Osman cropped up twice. One's a great uncle, the other's a great great uncle. Names are often repeated. Perhaps you know an uncle you particularly admire, or a father or grandmother or something like that, and you want to share that name and ensure it lives on. That was really common with our ancestors, especially when they had more children. Naming patterns are a good place to look and to begin with when we see, especially in Scotland. Very luckily, in Scotland, we often use our middle names as a way of honouring our mother's surnames. So we have a wonderful way of keeping those maternal names alive. it can be a great way of knowing if you've got the right person. In England and Wales and other places, we have said middle names can be used, but usually it's the first names. If you've got 8 children, we'll follow naming patterns. We might name one after the grandmother, one after a particular uncle, different things like that, and we see those names repeat. So it can give you a good indicator you're looking at the right family, especially when we're looking at larger families, people who perhaps moved around. We can take one of those more obscure names and use that to find the family, especially when they're younger. I see lots and lots of Sharon saying Scottish naming patterns are so helpful. They really are. They're not exclusive. They're not rules, but they're really great guides. So, follow this. Our ancestors are like us. They're individual. And so the things they do sometimes can be baffling. There's no logic to it. We have to think about, what's likely, think about, what we might have done, and use guidance from, what other people were doing. But no, they might have just thrown it all out of the window, and they might have just decided to do their own thing. And so that was kind of what makes family history so exciting and interesting, really. We have that wonderful bit of patchwork and that way of seeing, when our ancestors are different, they might be harder to find, but we can be sure there's more of a story there. So that's really exciting. And so, yes, see Rachel saying lots of repeats of maternal names, uses middle names in their ancestry. Diane saying Irish patterns are very similar. It's wonderful to see lots of people talking about these different things. In the last few minutes, I'm trying to run through really quickly to try and get things, because I've been talking for so long that I apologise. I've been getting through, and I might have missed some wonderful things. So I'm just seeing what we go. Should UK archives be made available before the 100 years' time? Maybe have a referendum to make it earlier. I think the government's slightly busy at the moment with something else, but there are a few questions about that. I think as we live longer, one of the risks that we have is perhaps the privacy time, as it contains now 100 years, might not be enough to be sure that everyone in there is no longer with us. It might mean we might end up with 110 or 120 year wait for certain things. So we have to be careful to hold on. I know as genealogists, we're very excited to see records, and we just want records, and that's brilliant. But there are some privacy concerns, and people have legitimate reasons for wanting these things to be kept closed and private. So we have this delicate balance. If it were up to me, we'd have every census tomorrow, but of course then there are other things that we have to look at. So I feel your pain, but it's going to be a little harder to see. And so see Karina sharing the British Badge Forum. I've not seen that before, but it looks like a great resource. I see Linda sharing the New Zealand Birth, Deaths and Marriage Index. We have a great index of that. Expect an update to that fairly soon. And let's see what else we've got in our final times. See the Manx are following names through generations. Very true. Dame Virelin's 103 years old. That's true. So she'll be on the 1921 census, I believe. We'll be able to see her very, very young. This is one of those things. There are many, many more people over 100, and so we have to think about them as well. And the same with if they're living and they're on the 1939 register and over 100, then if they are and they want to have their record closed, they can get in touch, and that can be done. See Sue saying hopefully we're all documenting our families now. I think we've hit the end of the hour with me wittering on to you about all kinds of family history things, and I do throw so much at you that I can hopefully be forgiven for maybe missing some of your questions and things. But if you've taken the time to ask a question, I will come back to you and I will answer you in the comments at some point. Hopefully tonight I'll get round to it and I'll fill in, because if you took the time to listen to me, it's only fair I take the time to reply to you. If we didn't get to do it live. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Hopefully it's been useful. It's been wonderful to share some time with you. I haven't been here for a little bit, and hopefully I'll be back very soon. I know Ellie's been suggesting some really exciting topics, so keep your ears peeled and your eyes peeled as well for this. Hopefully, you're keeping safe in all of this, keeping out of any illness, and if you are ill, get well soon. But hopefully, tune in to some of the other wonderful broadcasts as well from some of the Findmypast colleagues. There's some great ones coming. I think there's a good one on Thursday, good one on, is it Wednesday? Ellie will correct me. But there are lots, and then of course Alex on Friday as well. Lots to talk about, lots to see. Every Monday you'll see that thing. I deserve a cup of tea. You see, actually, I am in Scotland, so I have a glass of red cola, which is exciting for me. One of my ancestors invented red cola, so I'm kind of exciting. It's some would say not the greatest of drinks, but I find a little bit of an affinity for it, so it's quite wonderful, quite uniquely tasting. But it's going to be exciting when I get to sip this when I've finished. But yes, thank you very much, everyone who's been tuning in. Glad that everyone's had fun. And suggest things. Go to that Findmypast forum if you have more comments, queries. There's some wonderful people there, wonderful volunteers, excited to help with your family history queries. I think we might have one cooking from in-house that we might want your eyes on, so it's quite an exciting one. And we'd love to hear more from you there, and I'll try and delve in as well. Yes, you can watch this back if you've missed a piece, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. And yes, have a great time, and keep watching. Thanks very much.